There we go.
I'm not going to be
right?
at a loss for words here, but the work that you and the Judicial Crisis Network have done for years now on fighting for conservative judges, and the Gorsuch situation, and then the Kavanaugh situation, and now justice on trial, you guys have really profoundly, as an individual and as an organization, helped reshape the American judicial system and lay of the land. It's just, I can't thank you enough for the work you do. And I also know how much hate you get from so many people for doing it.
Yeah, it's definitely not always a popular job, but that's how you know you're accomplishing something, right? And I can't tell you how exciting it is now. I have been working on judges since 2010. So this is starting with Justice Stevens retiring and Elena Kagan replacing him, and through all of the Obama administration. And now it's like, oh my gosh, we're putting points on the board. We're really actually able to get some of these amazing judges through. And I wouldn't have thought going into 2016, when we were so devastated to see Justice Scalia pass away and going, oh my gosh, we may lose the court for a generation. And that in such a few short years, now we have, strangely enough, the president who has had the best judicial record, I think, certainly in my lifetime, of Republican presidents in Donald Trump. It's been such a privilege to be able to keep working, getting some of these judges confirmed.
Now, yes. Let's go back to the Obama administration, where there wasn't a lot that you could do to stop a lot, particularly after they wound down the filibuster for circuit judges. But can you talk for a little bit about being in the minority there and dealing with the Senate when you're opposing judges and what that's like?
Yeah, and that was something that, as you said, early on, there was at least a chance with the filibuster there. And the filibuster is something that historically wasn't ever used against judges, but was debuted in 2003 as a method for the minority to block judges that did have majority support. And just the threat of it, and there were not very many filibusters that the Republicans actually were willing to do. A lot of them were just objectively opposed to it, but the threat of having a potential filibuster out there at least allowed it in maybe a handful of cases that we could kind of pick the worst of the worst, the real bad judges, that we could say, okay, this person, maybe we will be able to get enough people together to threaten that they're not going to get the person through. And so we were able to block literally maybe a handful of people. And unfortunately, after the Democrats had gone crazy filibustering people like Miguel Estrada, who got filibustered 7 times for the DC Circuit, it only took a couple of those, and then suddenly the Democrats couldn't take the taste of their own medicine and got rid of the filibuster. After that, it was really frustrating, because then, if you don't have the majority in the Senate, there's not much you can do. And I think a lot of people will talk about the elections have consequences, and they certainly do, especially for the president who's making these appointments. But the Senate elections have huge consequences for judges, and the difference in so many cases between being able to have a chance to negotiate with a president like Obama, or when you switched and suddenly had like the Republicans in the majority in the Senate, that then you actually at least have some leverage. And so there's a lot of people, and I know there's groups in this room like Americans for Prosperity who were out there during elections making sure that the Senate stayed in hands of people who are going to be having good philosophies and judges. It doesn't have to be Republicans, but unfortunately most Democrats have kind of gone all in on the let's get people who are just going to be activists on the court. So. Yeah.
Now, I want to get your opinion now. So we have Kavanaugh and Gorsuch both on the court, and despite the narrative of you have this right-wing court, it always fascinates me how, despite the Linda Greenhouse narrative of the court and Dolly Lithwick and whatnot, that you actually have more ideological diversity among the supposed hardcore conservatives, because you always know, for the most part, how the 4 liberals are going to go, and there's always the wild card on the right.
Yeah, and I think that's because when you graph it, you often will see like boom, 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 4 liberals kind of in this very tight cluster, and then there's this everywhere from Chief Justice Roberts all the way over to like Justice Thomas on the other end, and they're kind of all spread out amongst the conservatives. And you saw that even this term, every member, except for maybe Justice Alito, of the conservative members of the court, had a case where they joined with the liberals in the court. And I think that's because we're looking at these people not because it's someone who's going to sit in the court and say, okay, who wins and who loses in this case? I'm with these guys. I'm voting for them. It's because they're looking at it from a principled perspective. And you have times where even an originalist and a textualist like Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas might come to different conclusions because they're just looking at some different perspective on that original intent. But the important thing is they're looking for the right thing. It's not, is this a good law? Is it written the way I would have wanted it? Is it doing things that I think are great for society? Is it where I think society wants to go? Those are questions for our politicians. If you're looking at the originalism and textualism doesn't give you the same answer every time, but it's a principled way to go about it. And that does result in some variety, but not every single one of our conservative justices is an originalist. Chief Justice Roberts never claims to be.
Right.
So, but I think you do have what we've seen this last term in particular, a really growing consensus of 4 justices on the right, and often joined by the Chief Justice, that do have that approach, where they're looking at the text and confining themselves to the original interpretation of the Constitution.
It's striking to me, particularly with Justice Gorsuch. I've got to say, we've had a number of cases this term where you had 4 conservative justices lying together, and Gorsuch with the left, and I read his decision, it's like, I think I'm kind of with him on this. It's just, he's a very interesting nominee in justice.
Again, there are different answers you can get coming at it from an originalist perspective, and a lot of times that happened with Justice Scalia. He had a lot of decisions, particularly I think in criminal law areas, where his philosophy would lead him to what looks like a liberal result, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's that he's kind of going off the rails. It's just he's reading the same information and kind of getting to a different end. Well,
and what strikes me about Gorsuch is it seems like he's playing a longer game. He and Kagan seem to play very long games where he's siding with the progressives on the court right now on some cases where I can already see that this precedent is going to be really useful for conservatives in some cases coming down the track.
Right, and that's because if you've got the sound principles, it is going to be a good result. This is why it's very short-sighted to say, even if it weren't just wrong on principle, to say, oh, I think this is the good guy, he's going to win in this case, boom. In many cases, I think of one of Justice Kavanaugh's opinions, for example. It was on campaign speech, and it was Emily's List versus the FEC. So this is a pro-abortion, liberal feminist organization, but they were making arguments about the fact that they should have the freedom to do campaign spending. This is part of their free speech rights, and he sided with them. So if you go and say, who's the liberal result and who's the conservative result, we're like, well, you're helping this liberal organization, but the principle is right, and that's the kind of thing that actually is what a judge is supposed to be doing, and it's the kind of thing that long-term is going to get our law back on the right track.
Before we get into your book and Kavanaugh, how did you get into doing this?
So I went to law school thinking I wanted to teach law. And then as I was preparing to go into legal academia, I got really frustrated because it's very difficult as a conservative to get hired and then further to get tenure anywhere. And so all the advice I was getting, and I think it was the right advice, is if you want to get tenure at a good school, you have to basically write on things that are not controversial and not say anything that's going to either out you as a conservative, or I had already clerked for Justice Thomas by this point, so I was kind of out there as a conservative, but you can't write about some of the hot button issues. You can write about something like tax law or like some boring areas that nobody cares about. You can't write about hot button things. And that was where I thought, oh my gosh, this sounds like a decades-long slog through stuff I don't care about before I can talk about the things that I think are important. So when this opportunity came up to work for JCN, I felt like it was just a great chance to say, you know what? Darn it, I'm not going to get confirmed to anything if I say the stuff I'm saying, but that's okay. It's an important battle, and it's actually, I feel like I can have more impact here than doing a lot of other things. And I've also got 6 kids at home, so I wanted something that was flexible, and it worked out to be a great alternative to the 90 hours a week in a law firm kind of option, and so much more fun.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I tell people all the time I would still be a lawyer, but they had this thing called a client, and I didn't like them.
Yep.
So now, let's get into this, because it is a legitimate bestseller.
Oh, yes.
One of those bestsellers that appears on the New York Times bestseller list and they pretend doesn't exist.
Yes, that's the only mention the New York Times has made of our book, the fact that they grudgingly had to put it on their bestseller list.
Right, and I read it was a really nasty piece by a journalist because a journalist is writing a book on the Kavanaugh hearings from the sympathetic portrayal of the left, that this was a rush job to get out before a legitimate journalist's book comes out. And yet, you read the book. I have not written my review yet because I hadn't finished the book, and I'm philosophically opposed to writing reviews of books I haven't read. You'd be amazed at the number of people who actually write reviews without reading the books. But just some of the accounts in there, just media bias and the background and what the White House, it's an amazing expose, not just on the hearings, but also how bad some people really were behind the scenes at just really trying to destroy a good man.
Yeah, well, to some extent, they're guilty as charged. We absolutely, Molly and I, we had the pedal to the metal to get this book done quickly, but it's not because we wanted to do a hack job. And I think, the proof is in the pudding. Read it yourself. We had a lot of people who said, wow, I actually thought it was, I was expecting, because we know you're both conservative, it was going to be just, all from one angle. But we tried to make sure we were absolutely factual and fair. We really wanted to do that fast because I clerked for Justice Thomas, as I said. We have seen what happened after his confirmation. It's not just they pack up and go home because they lost. Then they engaged in a decades-long campaign of propaganda, misinformation, so that everyone, going around at the time who watched those hearings, 2 to 1 Americans believed Anita Hill over Justice Thomas. Today, I think if you took that same survey, most people would say, oh, I thought it was obvious, wasn't she the one who definitely told the truth and Congress ignored her? That's what the story they have been told. We wanted to, while it was fresh in people's minds, and we talked to more than 100 people, from the president to Supreme Court justices to senators on down, to make sure we had the true facts out there, because we knew these stories are coming, and they're going to be revisionist history. So it's harder to do the revisionist history when you have a heavily footnoted, heavily researched book out there already doing it. And we'll see how well that works, but I think that's the first step in making sure that those alternate realities don't take root.
I have found it very, very funny in the last month or so. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has made multiple comments about what a great person Brett Kavanaugh is, and the amount of rage directed at her by people upset that she's upsetting the narrative about Brett Kavanaugh. It's actually been very, very funny to me, and part of me thinks, is she doing this on purpose? I have heard that she's always had a cordial relationship with him.
Remember, she famously had a great relationship with Justice Scalia. They would go to the opera together, and they were really close friends. So that may be, it may be the generational difference between people who are able to have discussions with people they disagree with and still go home and be friends. And then this modern version where the Democrats, at least the noisiest ones, are pushing the party as far to the left and take no prisoners, and you cannot normalize this. That, thankfully, is not yet how the Supreme Court functions. So we tell the story in Justice on Trial how after Kavanaugh was confirmed, actually the justices, his colleagues on both sides of the aisle, per se, wanted to show a lot of support. So normally this initial swearing in they do the day of the confirmation hearing is a kind of quick affair just so they can get their office set up and be official, and then they have the formal swearing in at the White House that everyone comes to. For his, on that Saturday, while people are storming the steps of the court, literally like banging down the doors of the court, every justice who was in town, from Justice Ginsberg and Justice Kagan to Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, they came to show solidarity. How Justice Kagan, the first day of hearings, purposely was speaking to him, shaking his hand, joking with him during the oral arguments, because they don't want their court to be politicized the way it's happening right now in the political process.
Just as an aside, I so often disagree with her, and I realize she does come from the left, but I actually, as a conservative, am impressed with the thoughtfulness of Justice Kagan. And I know that Justice Scalia was a fan of hers just at an academic level. It's just, it's nice from my vantage point to see a progressive on the court, particularly when I know that whenever there's a religious liberty case, Sotomayor and Ginsberg are always going to be on the left. To see Kagan, now, part of me understands what she's doing is she's also laying groundwork in these cases.
Yeah.
Yes, she actually is. But it's also very nice to see her out there willing to do some of this stuff. I'm just at an intellectual level, I appreciate the honesty on her side.
Yeah, she
scares me too, but
well, she has positioned herself as more of as a centrist, but I think a very influential one. And one of the things that does just worry me about that, though, is in recent reporting, particularly on the Obamacare decision. Everyone already knew and was frustrated by what the Chief Justice did, but some of the recent reporting that has come out on that it shows that Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer also flipped votes on that. They said, because they did not want to vote with the chief on the Medicaid expansion, and they actually flipped their votes. In what struck me from that description as a much more kind of transactional view of I'll trade you this vote for that vote kind of thing, even than the Chief Justice, as frustrating as his vote obviously was in that case. So that really worries me, because that is log rolling that is bad enough in Congress, and it really doesn't belong on the court. But she definitely is very smart, and I think this is, it's a blessing to have someone like a smart, thoughtful person on the court, but it's also something to watch out for, because I think if they're savvy in how to advance rationales that aren't
very
constitutionally sound, then you have to really worry. Yeah.
Well, I guess the thing, having middle lawyers, the thing that strikes me is if you read an opinion written by Justice Kagan versus an opinion written by Justice Sotomayor, you actually understand it. And can, as someone who has to advise businesses and individuals, understand this is what she's saying, as opposed to Sotomayor. I'm like, I guess she woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day. I don't know. Now, let's get back to the book here. What, in your mind, is kind of the thing that just, if you had to tell one person about one thing in the book, what really stands out? And I know there are several in there, though.
Oh, yeah. No, there's so much. I feel like Molly and I probably spent the first 6 to 8 weeks of doing this, and out of a very short process, just interviewing people. And we'd come home every night, and I'd be telling my husband, oh my gosh, you won't believe what we learned today. And it was like one story crazier after the other. I mean, I loved learning the personal side of things. There's lots of interesting stories about the Cavanaugh family and how they got through it. I think the craziest inside story that we didn't know existed really before we started it was the story about the anteroom. And there's actually a chapter toward the end of the book called The Anteroom Where It Happened. It's like a play on Hamilton, for those of you who've seen that. But it's what was going on with Jeff Flake that day, the fateful day when he was supposed to vote Kavanaugh out of committee, and he'd announced he was going to vote him out of committee, and then was assaulted in the elevator by these two activist women, which the media never mentioned, one of whom is like a paid community organizer, so not just someone who happened to be there, so she's professional. But then afterwards, after Senator Coons gives his talk, he signals to Flake, and they both go back into this anteroom, and everyone starts to realize, oh my gosh, something weird is going down here. And so slowly the dais empties of almost all the senators. Poor Chairman Grassley's like sitting there going, okay, there's no one left at this hearing, but I gotta just fill the time here waiting for someone to come back, because we know we need Jeff Flake's vote to get him out of committee. And it was all of the senators, it was like all of their staff. You've got it's a small little room off of the hearing room, and then there's this tiny phone booth. You've Jeff Flake and Chris Coons inside the phone booth together, sometimes with another staffer in there, sometimes with Senator Cornyn trying to fit in the phone booth too. They're hashing it out. It's just wild. People are shouting at each other. People keep on saying, get the staff out of here. The staff can't even reach the door to get out. President Bush was even trying to call to advocate for Kavanaugh. He couldn't get through. I mean, it was wild. Apparently, there were even Republican senators who by this point were so fed up with the shenanigans the Democrats have been playing, with the way they were abusing the process, that they threatened to punch out some as Democratic senators. This is something that if you watch C-SPAN, it's not normally this exciting. And if you do watch C-SPAN, I'm sorry. But anyway, it was really crazy. So we taught all of these people would start telling the story, and each one crazier. So we just started out our interviews eventually by saying, was it as crazy as we heard? And everyone's going, oh no, it was crazier. So one staffer at the end of it just said to another, I think we all just witnessed history. And I really think we did. I'm sort of sorry C-SPAN cameras weren't in there to see it, but we have the story there, and it's just wild to see the Senate breaking down like that.
I have to say, I try to, having worked for a number of years at CNN and then at Fox, I try to have some level of respect for members of the media who, many of whom I don't think have a willful and intentional bias. It really is worldview, I think. But I was horrified at people I've long thought were definitely of the left, but try to be fair, and the total breakdown in journalistic ethics when it came to the Kavanaugh situation and the advocacy of supposedly objective reporters. I mean, and I've always known the Linda Greenhouses of the world and whatnot were totally in the tank for the left, but others out there, I really was stunned by some of it, that they were really playing for keeps in ways the right never had.
Yeah, it was really discouraging to see some of the things and to learn some of the ways that it was, sometimes it's just, what do you choose to cover? So there was every line of Kavanaugh's yearbook was parsed, and you've got people there debating what his drinking games were and whether they were really something else and all this stuff. No one looked at her stuff. So we talk a little bit about all of the stories out there that just chose not to look at. But then at the worst extreme, there was even stuff that was actively covered up. So one of my big shocker ones that I didn't realize at the time was NBC News, toward the end of this whole crazy process, had interviewed Julie Swetnick. This was Michael Avenatti's client, who claimed that Kavanaugh had been, engaging in this serial gang rape cartel in Maryland, and it was just a ludicrous claim in the first place. She was interviewed by NBC News, and of course contradicted half of her statements in that testimony itself, which I thought was, I was sorry they ran it in one level because they shouldn't give her the credibility, but she so tanked herself that it was great. But one of the shocking things is, before that interview, Michael Avenatti had been talking about, I've got this other witness. She signed an affidavit, and she can corroborate this. And say what you will of the craziness of Swetnick's allegations, at least there were actual legal documents, sworn statements. Now, they were perjured statements, but they were sworn statements. And so NBC News interviewed this other witness. And what they learned was, she said, no, that's not the story I told. Michael Avenatti completely misused my words. I'm never talking to this guy again. It's totally, he's a liar. And they knew that, and they just said, we couldn't corroborate it. They didn't say, the people he says corroborate it say he's lying about it. This is even before he later then publicly announces and tweets out her affidavit. And still, they don't say, what would a blockbuster? Actually, this affidavit is something that's entirely false. They just let it be. And eventually, they wrote their article on October 25th. So weeks after he was confirmed. So they just kind of held if you were a news organization and you just wanted to get the news and get the most eyes on your website or on your channel, you would talk about what happened. Instead, they conveniently kept that quiet until it was too late to actually be of any assistance in finding the truth on this allegation.
I confess that the Kavanaugh situation is rapidly what pushed me towards saying, you know what, the president's standing up for these people when no other Republican would stand up for this. Other Republicans would have bailed on Kavanaugh by now. And here he is willing to stand up for and fight for this guy. Conservatives like me who have been skeptical of the president, we owe him huge thanks for standing up for a guy like Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh, he was not my first choice. In fact, among my circle of friends, he was none of our first choices. But the left really made us want to go to bat for this guy just because of what was being done to his family, which is horrible. I felt so sorry for his wife and children that they were being, a guy who shows up to help feed the poor every week. And now you have left-wing agitators coming, trying to prevent him from feeding the poor. It was a horrible situation.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many people that were involved in this process said exactly that it was, wow, thank goodness, thank God we had President Trump here, because what other Republican president would have stood by a nominee? And it would have been horrible for Kavanaugh himself, but also imagine for any future nominee. If you thought, hey, people could come against me, destroy my life, destroy my reputation, attack my family like this, and then the president's just going to let me loose. That would be the worst possible thing, both for trying to recruit great judges going forward and for creating an incentive for the left. Like I'm a mother of toddlers, among others. If you give them what they want every time they have a fit, they will just have more fits. And I think that is the lesson that President Trump seems to actually have internalized. That you can't just give in to people who have a meltdown and let them feel like they are having the upper hand. So I think if he had let that be a win for them, then we could have guaranteed every single nomination henceforth was going to have these uncorroborated claims, and they could take down anyone they wanted.
It seems like the left right now really is vetting all of the nominees on the potential maybe there will be another opening. Who knows? But they've got to build the opposition file now, and that Kavanaugh really is the beginning of something and not the end of something if we continue down this path.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think within the next 4 years, we will have at least one more vacancy on the court. So the question now is it Donald Trump who's going to be filling it? We know what his list of nominees looks like already. And he may continue to update it, which I actually am a big fan of. I like the fact that when he has seen other candidates that he thought we needed the list refreshed, we needed more people added, he did it publicly. It's transparent. You actually know who he's going to choose from. And yes, it gives him a chance to do some of that opposition research, but I think it's worth it for the communication it gives to the American public. Certainly I like it because then I can go forward and say with confidence, if he sticks to his list, I can support any of these people on this list because it's an amazing collection of men and women. But I think what the still mystery is what if that happens and it's a Democrat, what kind of nominee will we have? Except for that I know, we keep on telling the Democrats they're already working on coming up with lists of nominees. And we've had liberal groups like Alliance for Justice, a lot of the labor organizations, they're helping vet people to put on a list. What we don't know is who is on that list. And I can tell you, if they thought those people would help them in the polls, if they thought American people would like the people they want to put in the court, they'd be releasing that list. They don't want us to know because they know it'd be people who are too extreme, too activist for the American people.
Now, I want to shift gears and go to the other courts. What was it, Tuesday or Wednesday of this past week? I read that we now have the situation where the president essentially with the Senate in one day filled 1% of the vacancies in the federal courts.
Right, that was because we were able to get a package deal together through with the Democratic senators. What we historically, especially for district court level seats, that was something that you would almost always do this way. You just have a bunch of judges and everyone does voice votes, all in favor, aye, and they all just move through. That is something the Democrats have absolutely refused to do under Trump. So with almost no exceptions, would they move through judges with any speed. And it was only recently that Leader McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate were able to change the rules. So instead of wasting 30 hours of debate time for nominees, including nominees who literally had 100 votes, like no opposition to some of these people, and they would waste all this time on them. And 30 hours in Senate time, I say it's like dog years because they only work 3 days a week, and so it just kind of fills up. You waste a week on each person, you'll never get these spots filled. They're finally starting to get some judges confirmed, and so some of that is because some of those are people that are the blue state senators had to sign off on, and so they want to put in as well. But it's very exciting because finally we are starting to beat back some of the incredible deficit of judges. Up until recently, Donald Trump, who came into office with record high numbers of vacancies, had more vacancies created during his time in office than he had filled. So people were retiring faster than we could confirm them. We're finally getting ready to turn that down now that we've had some amendments to the rules and are moving things forward. So now we just have to keep that pace going because you've got to keep filling them because the seats keep on opening up, and we need to make sure that they're going to be good judges who are going to be faithful to the rule of law.
Last question for you. Can you real quick just give us a run through of what are some of the big circuit fights that we may have on the radar coming up?
I think the circuit court nominees has been amazing because between the president and Leader McConnell and Chairman Grassley and now Graham, they have really prioritized those, and so they got those seats filled immediately. And those are some of the best nominees that we've seen of any Republican president. So there's really only a few left. We've got the Ninth Circuit and the Second Circuit are where the nominees are still outstanding. The Ninth is really exciting because this is traditionally the craziest circuit out there. People call it the Ninth Circus because it's so far left. It is the most overturned by the Supreme Court. And it used to be just where good law went to die. And now it's finally, once the president fills these last couple vacancies in the Ninth Circuit, it'll be 13 to 16 in terms of Democrat-Republican nominees. You actually have a shot to get a good panel or even a good mix on an en banc hearing in the Ninth Circuit, and that is something that we haven't seen in a long time. I think a lot of people didn't think we would see in our lifetimes. So that's incredible. And on top of which, these aren't just Republican nominees, because unfortunately, even when you're replacing Republican nominees, I think we're making a lot of progress, because instead of the wishy-washy Republican nominee, we are now getting solid, young, up-and-coming, brilliant nominees. And so those 13 Republican judges in the Ninth Circuit are really going to be making some real progress in terms of returning the law to what it actually says. And that's all we're asking. Now, you don't have to have judges who are going to go in there and say, okay, President Trump always wins. That's not what they're supposed to do. It's just read the law. If it's a liberal law, if it's a conservative law, I don't care. Do what the law says, and then leave the rest of that to the political process, and you know, let the elected branches handle that.
I have so enjoyed this. Thank you so much. Carrie, thank you.
Thanks.